Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to America is Not Rome Part 2. And in this section, I want to go over some issues that people raised in the first, but the key point I want to make is I think one of the things that people are responding to, or what's driving this comparison with Rome, is, again, I used the word decadent last time. It's like we're falling in this moral lapse, and this was this critique of the Roman Empire that became popular with the decline and the fall, the publication of the decline and the fall of the Roman Empire over 100 years ago, which kind of made this argument that the Rome had fallen from its true values. This was an argument the Romans themselves made, and they said it was functionally an ethical problem. It was a problem of not having the old ways and maintaining those, and hence they had lost their vigor and their way, and of course then they collapse. And I said that, this is sort of today this is kind of a modern Calvinist critique, which wants to track everything back to a moral foundation, that there's some moral problem that at the heart of everything that goes wrong with the world, and that this is then expressed with the collapse of systems or other issues. Now, I do want to argue, however, that the U.S. is decadent, but it's not decadent in the way that Rome is purported to have been decadent. Rather, it is decadent in a definition that I took from Barzon. It's not just his, but I think it's a great definition that I found for the first time in Barzon many years ago, Jacques Barzon. And one of his great books is actually called From Dawn to Decadence, and he thought that's where we were in a decadent period. And the definition that he uses here is that during a classical age, the main power structures agree on what they're arguing about. And so that you're in a context in which you agree on some core fundamentals, and then all of the other debate rages, but it's fine because you all have some fundamental agreement at the core of this. And the classic example here is the Catholic Church before the Reformation, and people always look back and they go, wow, there was so much, debate, there's heresy. I mean, there's just this ongoing, incredibly vigorous, multi-century debate about what it meant to be Catholic, what the rules were, just every possible aspect of interpretation of the Gospels. But you didn't get burned at the stake until you violated some real core principles, and most people did not violate those. And so there was this vast range of agreement that, we're going to agree with the Pope, we're going to agree on some other core principles, and then within that, we're going to have lots and lots and lots of, discussion, debate, disagreement. And so it wasn't this closed, unitary, intellectually barren collection of drones that were leading the intellectual life of the Catholic Church. Quite the contrary. It was these incredibly vigorous monks and cardinals and priests who were thinking and trying to explore and understand, but within a shared context. What Luther did, or what Luther brought to fruition, not that other people hadn't made some of Luther's arguments, but what he brought to actual action did strike at those core issues. And so there was nothing, the Catholic Church could not agree with Luther because that would have been the end of the Catholic Church, right? So this is the problem that they have. And so you go from being a classic system, most people, most of the time, agree about what they're arguing about, if that makes sense, to a decadent phase, which is where, those people, we're just talking past each other because we don't even agree about what we're arguing about anymore. So, for instance, you can argue about what kinds of insight the Pope gets from prayer or from God or whatever, but that the Pope can do things or say things or is the Pope, so you can't argue about that, right? So what it means to be Pope, you can argue about, but that there is a Pope, you're not supposed to argue about that, right? So it's these kinds of lines. And once you start saying, well, there just isn't a Pope, well, it's like, well, no, we're going to just assume there's a Pope. Here we go. So these are the problems you run into between between a classical age and a decadent age. And I do think we're in a decadent age because what you see in the United States today, and it's not just the U.S., but I'm using the U.S. as what we're talking about now, is a failure to agree about what you're arguing about. And the best way I can articulate this is if you look at the two contemporary parties, and for those people outside the United States, you probably know this, but it really is pretty much a two-party system. I mean, we have two dominant political parties, and that is it. So we don't have a parliamentary system that allows for the expression of more nuanced or more diverse positions. That happens within the parties, but it's definitely a two-party system. But we have one party, which is a conservative party, and this is what I think people misunderstand. And this is, I don't really talk about politics too much, but in this case, it's such a historically clear example of where we are that it is just, this is not a political argument. I think this is an argument about one way to really think about the politics, because this has happened over and over again historically. I'll give a few examples here. But we have a conservative party in the United States, which is functionally attached to the status quo. Like it's and this is the Democrats, by the way. The Democrats are a very conservative party by historical political definitions, because what they want to do, and you see this both at the state and the national level, is basically maintain the status quo. Things are okay. We just need to adjust how the engine is running, change the tires, this kind of approach. And then you have another party, in this case the Republicans, who are essentially anarchic, which is to say they don't like how things are running and they want them to go away, but they don't have a replacement philosophy. So usually, or not usually, but often in history, you get different parties that have different visions of what should happen next. And they negotiate and argue their way to these compromises and all this between different factions and approaches. And this is totally standard and very common. This happens all over Europe. You'll see this in their parliaments because they have, different parties that have to kind of compromise and come to some agreement to get things done. You're in a different historical context when you have a large, important political actors who have no plan, right? Who don't want what they want, that they know the system is not working, or they believe the system is not working, and so they want it to go away, but they don't have a model or a clear plan to replace it, so that you can negotiate about that. And this is why I say you end up in a decadent phase, because it's hard for people with these divergent outlooks to negotiate, because they don't have a shared vision of some greater structure in which they're acting. So to give a comparison here, recently the Biden administration has been trying to forgive student loans because they argue that the student loan system is broken in the United States. College higher education financing is broken. And so students take out a bunch of debt, difficult for them to repay. This isn't good. So let's forgive the debt. Now notice, this is an incredibly conservative approach because it does nothing about the system, right? And that's how you can... and by the way, this isn't just in the United States. In any system, you can look at this and you can say, okay, you see a problem. You can address the problem by trying to adjust at the margins or make some kind of tweak, or in this case, simply go, oh, everybody has too much debt. Well, we'll just forgive the debt and we'll just do this again. Apparently, I don't know if you would just do this every 5 years, just forgive everybody's debt. By the way, historically, this has happened. Like going all the way back to the Babylonians. Yes, the Babylonians did this, and I can't remember the word that they had for like a periodic, basically, debt forgiveness day. And what they realized is that too much debt was building up, and so you just forgive it every once in a while. But notice, this maintains the system as it exists. So you recognize a problem, but you don't change the system. You simply ameliorate the immediate byproduct of this. And you go, oh, okay, too much debt. Let's get rid of this. I mean, a different approach, of course, would be to say, a less conservative approach would be to go, well, this is a silly system that throws up all these loans, so let's get rid of that system and replace it with a new system. And but that's not what was being approached or what was being worked on. So a very conservative. You can look at this across the board. This is generally what the Dems are always talking about, and what they're proposing both at state and national levels is ways to ameliorate or adjust or respond to difficulties in the existing system. On the other hand, and again, these are not black and white, of course, but you just very strong tendencies. You have the Republicans who tend to look at what is existing, says there are problems. Okay, they agree that there's problems. Everybody knows this. And you go, oh, but the way to address this is just to either, if you look at language, it's eliminate, cut, get rid of. So you have a problem with education, get rid of the education department. It was great. This identifies the system as the problem, right? So it's an anti-system argument. Eliminate the IRS. So, which I'll give you a historical example of this, by the way, very soon. So the idea is like, eliminate the IRS. Now, a conservative or even a non-conservative, but with a plan sort of political outlook would say, let's eliminate the IRS and then we'll replace the existing tax structure with this plan over here and da-da-da-da. Well, this does not exist. However, the concept of eliminating the IRS actually does exist. And so you go, problem or perceived problem, let's just get rid of it, right? And so these two kinds of mindsets have a very difficult time communicating, because if you come in and say, we don't like the existing tax structure, let's negotiate some more progressive, more regressive, more fair, less fair, it just doesn't matter, right? The actual negotiations inside of that bubble don't matter. But if you say, we don't like the existing tax structure, eliminate the taxing body, so they're functionally, we don't have a taxing structure, this is a very different kind of outlook. And so when I say the United States is in a decadent phase, I think this is one of the things that becomes quite clear is that the groups are just talking past each other, right? Like there's no communication going on. And this is sort of an interesting concept. Is the United States then like other countries that have failed because they have fallen into these periods of decadence? And it's not clear that decadence leads to decline. So this is one of the interesting things. And again, the example I'll give here coming up. But it is clear that countries do this occasionally, and they often come out doing quite well. They go, we don't agree anymore. We have to come up with a new organization and a new framework in which we can operate that we all agree about. So just to give a different example of this, and one from French history, is the French Revolution. So there was all kinds of problems. The ostensible cause of the French Revolution was a very serious financial problem, and they've been trying to get it under control for a long time. Taxes, finance, always there, but also, structural issues. There are many problems, and it kind of, for various historical reasons that we can't go into now, came to a head. And they convened the Estates General, which was sort of a gathering of representatives of the three estates, being the first states being the clergy, of which I think there was about 100,000-ish, give or take. I don't think there were that many, maybe 90,000 clergy in France at the time. And they called them estates because they were under different legal, political control, right? So they had their own set of laws, they had their own program. They were over in one set over here. Then you had the aristocracy. There were more than there were priests in the first estate, but say 300,000 or 400,000 aristocrats, and so they formed their own set of laws, all this other thing. And then you had everybody else, the third estate, and they were the third group, all operating under the king. And so when the Estates General is convened to try and address collectively the problems that France was facing, what they said was, hey, look, we're going to do this under the existing program. And they all kind of agreed about that. Like, okay, yeah, let's get everybody together. We agree that there's three estates, that the three estates, however this works out, whatever arguments we have, will be argued out within the context of three estates, because that's what we are, that's what we do, and then the three estates operate under the king. Great, all agreed. Pretty quickly, the third estate decided, like, hey, no, we don't agree with this, right? We think should have the authority because were the most numerous, basically a democratic argument, that we are representatives of the most people, and we're 90 whatever 5% of the population of France. We should be the voice of everybody. We're all in this together. We're a single collective, even theoretically under the king, but basically this is a totally different relationship. And so at that point, everything freezes. So there's lots of complexities and subtleties here, but functionally, the king at this point, right? You're saying that the structure itself is completely unacceptable. And so we were talking past each other. And then, of course, this is when the gunfire starts. I'm not saying the United States is on the verge of civil war or anything like this, but just as an example, historically, it could have been resolved other ways. But this is when it became perfectly clear, now we're in a decadent phase. When they first got together, even though it was chaos and nobody agreed about anything, and it was all different parties with different interests and corruption and blah 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 blah, everything was a problem. The actual agreement that brought them together, when they started, they were all like, okay, yeah, we can see that this is workable. We agree to this. Let's roll with this. And then one party, with a third, when one of the three estates says, no, we don't want to play in this game because it's a game rigged against us, because basically what you had was 95% of the people got one vote. 100,000 clergies got one vote, and the aristocracy got one vote. And so you can see, as long as the clergy and the aristocracy sided with each other, the 95% of the population things weren't going to go their way. And so then they said, well, forget this system. We're going to throw it out, right? And at that point, you enter a decadent age, because now the arguments are like, we just don't accept your arguments. Like, you're talking about taxes. So what happens, just as a specific example, is the Third Estate formed a national assembly and said, no, we're going to eliminate all taxes. Roughly at the same time, the king was saying, okay, we're going to give a lot of ground on taxes. We're going to negotiate new taxes. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. A lot of which were demands which earlier had been made. But once the National Assembly gets formed and the Third Estate says we no longer represent this, now we're not arguing about what taxes we'll accept, what structure we'll accept. We're just on two different pages. We're like, it's not about that anymore, right? We're arguing at a much deeper level about the structure of what's going on. And so I think it's a much better way to think about where the United States is that we've entered this stage, which I've mentioned before, of decadence in this particular sense of not classical, in that we no longer really have a firm concept of what it is we're arguing about communally. And people go, oh, well, this is a divided country. I mean, sure, whatever. But I think a better way to think about this is people are unhappy with the system, and they don't know what the best way to respond to that is. So some messages, like the populist message that people talk about, resonate. But if you really look, and if you look all over the world, basically whoever's in power is in trouble, as a rough estimate, which means that this is not just a U.S. phenomenon, it's a global phenomenon that the populations are getting restive. They're unhappy for various reasons with what's going on. And so, conservative governments got punished in England, or conservative in the traditional sense, not in the sense I was talking about, but in India and England, they got punished, and liberal governments or more progressive governments, or what do you want to call them, traditional like labor governments, or theoretically more democratic governments, in the sense of Democratic Party, got punished in other places, right? So it's less left-wing, right-wing argument, I would say at this point, is becoming pretty clear, as opposed to this kind of problem, is people aren't sure what it is they're hoping for because they don't have a clear agreement on what it is we're supposed to be working towards. And so when you get into a decadent age, it becomes very noisy. And you go, we don't like this. Are we trying to do? We don't like the way higher education is funded. Are we trying to do a tweak to that? Are we coming up with an interesting new program that basically doesn't change the function or core or structure of anything? Or we just want to just get rid of it, just eliminate it completely, just get rid of education, forget about that. We don't need that anymore, right? These are just so worlds apart, and people are like, oh, I am frustrated with things. I don't know if I want that much. We definitely need change, right? Until you get this. And so when they talk about people having a hard time communicating, this is one of the big signs that you're in a decadent age. Again, it's that ability to feel like you have the shared common ground goes away. And I think the misreading that you see so much, and then what makes people feel like, oh, the U.S. is losing its place, it's going to fall like Rome, which was an ostensible reason for starting this, was going to be 3, I think just 2 lectures now, is this struggle to feel that we have a shared cooperative endeavor that allows us to create a shared story that makes us all feel like we're working together, even when we disagree about everything else. And that is definitionally, as far as Barzan and other things are concerned, what happens when you enter a decadent age. But again, this isn't decadence in the sense of moral decadence. It's decadence in the sense of sort of not a shared vision. And that, I think, is what people are feeling above and beyond, or at least it's certainly one of the main drivers of what we're seeing and why we get confused about it. And so some people responded to the first lecture and said, hey, we're not like the Ottoman Empire, we're more like Carthage. And to be clear again, the idea is not that the U.S. is structured a lot like the Ottoman Empire. It's just that it's very big, very complex, and lasted a long time as a big, complex, powerful actor in the case of the Ottoman Turkish Empire in the area of the world where they had reach, right? They weren't truly global because that didn't come into existence yet. And the decline, quote unquote decline, was a very wavy, very long periods of recovery, periods of decline, periods. That is much, I would say, generally more representative historically of these great powers. Several people said, we're like Carthage, which was an amazingly complex, big, powerful society, but Carthage did have a termination date. I mean, Carthage really did fall. I mean, where the Roman Empire fell on that clear date, it didn't really, but that's how we imagine. When there was a day the barbarians showed up, they won the battle, that was it for Rome. This is not what happened to Rome, but that's kind of how people imagine it. But that's actually the case of Carthage, but it was the Romans. Right, the Romans famously, whether it's true, it seems to be true-ish at least, that Cato, the elder or the younger, that dates Third Punic Wars. I think this would be Cato the Elder. Should have checked that. My apologies. If not the Cato the Elder, it was got to be Cato the Elder. Would end a bunch of his speeches in the Senate saying, Carthago, pardon my Latin, Carthago delenda est. Carthago delenda est. I think that's it. Which is to say, hey, we've just got to destroy Carthage. We got to conquer them. They need crushing. And he just kept saying that until they launched the Third Punic War, and they just crushed Carthage. So it had a termination date. Carthage, powerful empire. The Third Punic War, Rome rolls in. It just doesn't exist anymore. I mean, of course, elements of it exist, but Rome takes over, crushes them in the dirt, and that is that. So that notion, I think, is what I struggle with, right? So this sense of, you can fall into a decadent phase. This does not mean you cannot rise out of it, right? That you cannot reestablish. And I think historically countries have done this, empires have done this, right? These cultural entities have coalesced, had powerful cohesion, weakened, and then recoalesced. And this, I think, is a more, I don't want to say natural, more statistically representative of the pathways of large powers in history. And this is where, I think we love clarity, which makes sense. But history is sometimes quite clear. The case of Carthage, wow, here come the Romans, and Wednesday at noon, so much for Carthage. And they just disassembled it. I mean, they literally salted the ground. It's Carthage, done. Cartha Delinda, yeah, that was it. Whereas with Rome, I mean, very long tail off, Eastern, Western Roman empires, right? So these kinds of concepts. So that's what I'm arguing for. So when you think of it as a decadence, just think of it as a phase that then can recoalesce in a new narrative, a new understanding that will allow people to argue about a shared vision that does then give you that sense of vigor and power and control. Another comment that came up in response to the other one is many people refer to the United States now as an oligarchy. And again, now we're in definitional things, which I always struggle with, but I do think it's important to articulate that by classical definitions, which is, of course, where we're taking the term, and by modern comparisons, the United States is not an oligarchy because that's usually, controlled by a small number of actors. What small number? 15, 20, pick your number, but a very small number of actors controlling all your central things. And this is not the case. Now that lots of entities have way oversized influence than they should relative to sort of an imagined democratic ideal, absolutely. But that does not, in fact, make, by definition, an oligarchy, because the number of actors in the American political, cultural, economic scene is just, there's a lot of them, and a lot of them have a lot of power, and they're not necessarily all agreeing about things. And again, this is one of the difficulties that we're struggling with, back to why, I'll just keep going back to decadence, obviously, because the subject of this lecture. It's one of the things that I think people want there to be an oligarchy, or they want there to be tyranny, even if they disagree with it, is because then it's coherent and it's easy to understand. What having, dozens to hundreds of really powerful actors in different phases and in different geographic and economic or socio-political areas does is it makes it hard to understand what's going on. And and so we really want there to be 5 bad people or good people in particular hats, so they're easy to identify, and then we can go, you're good, you're bad, things are good, things are bad. And one of the attractions of oligarchy is, in fact, that it gives you a very small group of coherent actors who, in theory, although in practice, your mileage may vary, history suggests, can do things efficiently and effectively, and can be vigorous and help you to feel like, oh yeah, those 10 families, those 5 houses, those Venetian merchant princes, they make everything run. Venice is great, or, the Athens is doing well. That kind of model really, it has an appeal. And so whether you think oligarchy is a good idea or bad idea, that appeal historically has been specifically that, like, oh, we don't want a tyrant because we recognize that's a little too much power. But, if we diffuse it through 5 or 6 people or 10 people or 20 houses or families, and they run everything, then that makes us feel good because we can identify with them. They're identifiable. It's a number of people I can count. Life is good. When you're in a multi-power system, it's just very complicated and confusing, and lends our sense of decadence and incoherence and struggle to comprehend, which then makes us think something is wrong and we don't know how to fix it, which, definitionally, right back to this sense of decadence. And again, part of it, I mentioned last time that the U.S.'s position in the world has relatively shrunk in power. Like if you look at economic power, this number is staggering, by the way, because I did look this up. In 1960, the U.S. was 40%. That's 40% of the global economy. I mean, that number is just, because we're talking about at that point maybe 12% of the population of the world, maybe not even 12% of the population. What would we be? No, it can't be even that high. Anyway, a vanishingly small percentage of the world's population with 40% of the GDP. This is economic dominance on an unprecedented scale. Today, still a staggering 25% of global GDP is generated by the United States. You can argue about how that's counted, blah, blah, but it works out to be as, wow, that's a really, really big number. It's a significant difference from 25%. I mean, from 40%. That is a lot less. And so that comparative sense of power and authority shrinks. Also, the percentage of this of economic activity that is generated by corporate or global actors also makes this confusing because they are by definition transnational. And so when significant parts of your GDP are being generated by transnational actors, this also lends a sense of diffuseness, right? Like, that 40% was more concentrated internal to the United States. Now we're not just a smaller percentage, we're also a smaller percentage, a big part of which is derived from transnational institutions, which makes your nation, doesn't just feel less powerful and less coherent and focused. It is. I mean, that's, again, that's not too arguable, I would say. And so that sense of, we aren't where we were is true, it is accurate. And so when you think about those sorts of transitions and why people, the way political, economic, global actors have to be interpreted in a local sense is, that does create a challenge. It does create a sense of a weakness, of something is wrong. Like where did we go wrong? That would all of a sudden we're smaller, more diffuse, less focused, less coherent. And so all of these different elements do add up to giving that sense. But by the way, this is not just, and this to expand this out, is not just a sense in the U.S. As I mentioned, these sorts of political sensibilities are taking place all over the world as countries struggle to now grasp what it is that was created from this massive globalization push that we experienced from, pick a date, say it's late 70s through until 2014, 15, where things, again, pick a date where things start to go shift the other way. But it was a long run, and now we're there, and people are like, we're not sure how to respond to that. We're not sure we agree with this structure anymore. We're not sure we agree with what we're working towards. And one example to give you, again, this sense of the EU Parliament had been working on a farm trade deal with Central and South America for a long time. But it's clear that this is sort of this vestigial hangover, because if you were trying to propose this trade deal today, it would get zero off the ground. But by the time, and this has been years and years in the making, but it was sort of began growing, if you will, a seed that was planted in the heyday of globalization and free trade and all of that. Well, it's coming to flower today when the winds have shifted. Like the political, organic, communal sensibility about this is not nearly as unanimous as it was, but many of the sort of elected and appointed figures in the European Parliament and bureaucracy are still pushing for this, while many of the domestic politicians and leaders and farmer representatives and stuff, they're very dubious. So this ground has shifted significantly in that time. And so you see these disconnects that are expressed all over the place. So the sense is not just a U.S. sense, and so it means there's something global going on, clearly linked with sort of global trade, not just with, but partly just linked with global trade. And so when we think about the lifespan of countries and sort of the Spangler vision of the patterns in world history and all this, I'm a big believer that world history follows specific seasons or patterns or whatnot, and that it's scripted. But it is clear that any major political entity, be a country, an empire, has moments of expansion and contraction, and has moments of, vigor and less vigor, just, can't be steady state. So something's got to change. And that what often accompanies this is this sense of, oh, we don't know anymore. We're in a decadent age. And clearly, I would argue that we clearly are, and it's helpful to think of it that way. But it doesn't mean that some amazing events, internal cohesion, a new goal, an external threat, a new narrative, these come along, and then all of a sudden people are galvanized again, and they feel how true it is. They feel like, oh, we have problems, but we're addressing the problems, that we have the capacity to address the problems. Things are going to get better. We are going to get stronger. Things are going to resolve in a good way. And so when we think about the fall of the Roman Empire, again, too often it's under the idea that, oh, there was this day when Rome got weak and then the barbarians came in, and that was in for Rome, which, again, how historically accurate this is, we'll put that aside. That's the narrative that people have. But I think better, more accurate, and more helpful to think about within this sense of classical and decadent ages, when there is this sense of internal cohesion and a sense of agreement about what we're arguing about, and then ages when we just don't, and that those our old narratives aren't working, and we need to come up with new ones and new strategies and new ideas, and that much of the friction and disagreement that we now experience comes from this disjuncture between attempts to save a system by conservative powers that aren't really addressing that well the frustrations of the people, combined with often no clear path forward, but people who are willing to say, oh yeah, let's blow it up, which is also not a clear path forward. So neither is in some way that fundamentally helpful, right? It doesn't give you that resolution you want, but it is distinctive and clear evidence that we are in a period of decadence, not collapse, not revolution, just core decadence. So, thank you very much.